Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first episode of the H&J podcast. Really excited to be starting this up. Today's episode is going to be about Western civilization. It's going to be a little different from some of ours in the future. So it's a little more scripted because it's a project I have to do. We're really excited. My name's Jake, by the way, and over here
I'm Hunter, and I'm pretty excited for this podcast to get going. It's been a big passion of ours for like about 2 weeks,
Right, yeah, yep.
So, yeah.
We're really excited to get this show on the road. Today we're going to be talking about why has Western thought continued to thrive up to this present day. So everyone has a preconceived notion of what they believe Western thought looks like. But today we're going to be exploring this question, why has Western thought continued to thrive in the first place? The argument I'm going to be presenting is made from a Christian perspective that emphasizes philosophy as one of the key driving factors in the growth of Western civilization. The evolution of Western thought has literally shaped how we view the world. It's the reason why we have schools. It's the reason our political system exists. It's the reason how we view truth. It's the reason you're actually listening to me right now. Modern innovation is actually mainly the result of Western civilization.
Yeah, pretty much everything that goes on in our society is a result of our freedom and Western thought and what it's given our society.
Exactly. So Western thought and innovation have constantly and completely changed the world unlike any other culture in existence. But before we actually dive into Western thought and philosophy, we need to actually define what Western civilization is.
Very, very important to define our terms before we start.
So we have the same Western Civ professor, Professor Finnegan. Shout out Professor Finnegan.
Yes, sir.
He defined Western civilization as the cultural and intellectual inheritance of Christendom. Nothing wrong with that definition. I just want to add to it, stating that Western civilization is the cultural and intellectual legacy of Christendom, along with the cultural and intellectual legacy and philosophy and tradition of the Greco-Roman heritage.
Right. And I would say this is probably the foundation of Western Civ. This kind of goes into the early philosophy and things that date back to ancient times. Pretty much.
Pretty ancient.
Yeah.
Like Hunter said, we're going to be starting with early philosophy. Ancient philosophy. Philosophy is founded by the Greeks as a way to understand the world and attain wisdom and gain knowledge. In The Consequence of Ideas, R.C. Sproul states that the origin of Western philosophy is rooted in the ancient Aegean or Greek world. The Great Conversation by the Oxford University Press accredits Thales of Miletus as actually being the founder of philosophy. Thales was a part of the pre-Socratic group, which sought after a substance called arche, which essentially is the Greek word for the ultimate source of stuff, what everything is made of. So Thales believed that the arche of the universe was water, which, because water is gas, liquid, solid. So he observed the three states of matter within water, and he believed that was kind of the fundamental source of everything that exists.
Yeah, I find it very intriguing and fascinating that the Greeks had such a passion for searching for the truth. Mm-hmm. Like Thales, for example, he was would you say he's like probably one of the first scientists kind of contributing?
Loosely, I would loosely give him that term, so? But yeah.
He gave like the first thoughts.
Yeah, he was the first one to move from a mythological perspective of knowledge to more of a grounded in reality sense.
Yeah, like physical and exactly.
Yeah. So after you get past the pre-Socratic, so before Socrates, you get to Socrates and Plato, the student mentor mentality. So everyone's heard of the Socratic method, where you have a dialogue where someone's asking questions and you're asking questions back to kind of uncover what the truth is. That was one of the main prospects of Socrates. He wanted to uncover truth and knowledge to its purest form. While Plato, he had a dualism where he believed that knowledge was actually in an ethereal sense. It was in another world. We couldn't actually attain it. We can only attain it through putting off the body and actually going into that realm.
Right. And it's also interesting. I've been researching a little bit about this. Plato and Aristotle, they seem to have kind of a tension. Mm-hmm. Like they kind of contradicted each other exactly to the point where Plato is more up there, right. Aristotle is more down here.
Right. So Plato's, like Hunter was saying, Plato's student Aristotle agreed with Plato there is a ultimate knowledge and truth, but it wasn't in another reality. It was within reality itself. He believed that the forms were within something like this table or this computer, which is kind of an interesting concept. We don't really believe in that anymore, but it's interesting to see this type of thought evolve from a very early, this is 500 BC, something like that.
Yeah, it's pretty old. And it's also funny, there's like a little bit of a teacher-student tension, and I don't know if Plato really was very fond of Aristotle going against himself, you know what I mean? So with all this early philosophy, how do you say that early philosophy, how does it lay the foundation for Western civilization?
I think this lays the foundation of Western civilization because it's kind of the first pursuit of knowledge. A lot of what Western civilization does is that it searches for truth. Yeah. And what the early Greeks did with philosophy is that they were trying to find truth, like I said before. Yeah. So I really think that's kind of just the baseline level for Western civilization is the foundation of philosophy.
Yeah, for sure.
So next we're going to move on to the Middle Ages. There's a lot to cover in the Middle Ages. I'm going to try to keep this brief. Didn't realize how much stuff there was in the Middle Ages, honestly.
A big amount of notes.
Yeah, it's about 2 pages here. So a lot happened in the Middle Ages. We had the fall of the Roman Empire, the rise of the Holy Roman Empire. We see a massive growth in the Catholic Church, conflict of magisterial powers, and then towards the tail end of the Middle Ages, we see a massive reformation that calls for a restructuring and reform in the church itself and Christian doctrine. But before we even get to that, we have to talk about Augustine. Augustine actually has still influenced how we view Christian theology today. Augustine became the Bishop of Hippo in 391 after a long journey and finally converted to Christianity a few years before that, before he was crowned bishop. He's an extremely important figure in the Christian faith because he combined philosophy to Christian theology.
Right. With his confessions and his other works and stuff like that.
He saw a lot of similarities with the Platonists in his when he was going through the Christian theology. And it was actually in the Contra Academicos towards the end. He said, I agree more with the Platonists in our Christian faith than I do with the skeptics.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
I actually had to write a whole paper on that.
You know a lot about that.
Right. Augustine was actually really important because he had 3 fundamental truths that kind of shape a lot of what we believe today, even though it was kind of shocking back then. Number 1, truth is one. Truth is one substance. It's all of God. 2, all men have been enlightened by the word or the wisdom of God. That goes back to Paul in Romans. And then 3, humans in pride have turned away from God and from truth. That's kind of the whole fallen aspect where Adam and Eve ate the fruit. It was a pride aspect. Satan had the same thing as well. But Augustine also believed that faith was an essential ingredient to attain knowledge. Without faith, there was no way to actually know anything. This type of thought would be incredibly impactful to the evolution of the church because that's how people would start to gain knowledge was through faith in God and revelation.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting thought. Like without faith, you can't really know anything because I guess to really know truth, you have to believe that you can acquire it.
Sorry about that.
Little malfunction.
Battery died.
We're still noobs at this.
Right.
So it's okay.
Anyway, so you were saying.
Yeah. I was talking about faith and you can't, without faith, you can't find truth. And I found it very interesting that you have to believe you can acquire something before you actually acquire it. It's kind of like self-manifestation in a sense.
Yeah.
But he's talking probably a bit more of like a deeper
faith.
Faith. But it's kind of interesting to think like with sports or something like that. You could probably say that they say, I'm going to believe I'm going to win. I believe I'm going to do this. And it happens because they have confidence. It seems like that's kind of the idea I was going for.
Yeah.
But I just found that very interesting.
Right. Definitely. So fast forward to the Reformation, about 1,200 years later.
Big gap.
Pretty big jump. So this is by no means a Catholic bash at all. But I do need to talk about the medieval Catholic Church because that's very important to Western civilization as a whole. because it was the whole restructuring of the church. Basically, is what led us to where we are today.
Yeah, and the church pretty much was the world at that time, in Europe especially.
Right.
Yeah.
Or Christendom.
Pretty much.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So the medieval church, especially the Catholic Church, was really corrupt. It had a lot of idolatry. It had a lot of what's the word? People were paying for forgiveness of sins.
Yeah.
It wasn't the best situation.
System. Yeah.
No.
It wasn't the best system.
It really, how I was looking at it, it's a really humane version of Christianity. So if a human objectively looked at the Bible and then applied it without any knowledge of what God had done,
right, and
put that into practice, is what that looked like. Which the Catholic Church looks completely different than it did in ancient times. They actually, in medieval times, they acknowledged what was going on. They corrected it. They fixed a lot of their doctrine. They got rid of these corrupt practices. But in reality, actually, conservative Protestants and Catholics have more in common denominational-wise than liberal Protestants do with them.
Yeah. There's also an interesting thought that I have just learned, and it's in the translations of the Bible, the New Testament. The Latin Bible, the Vulgate, which the Catholic Church used, had a lot of issues, a lot of mistranslations. And whenever, I can't remember the name of the guy who went back to the Greek, and
it was Erasmus.
There was this one verse where I can't remember the exact verse.
It was like, repent, the kingdom of God.
Yeah, but in the Latin it was
give penance.
Give penance.
Yeah.
And that's what the Catholic Church did. And there was a lot of things that are wrong with that.
I don't want to necessarily dive into penance, because that's a whole other thing, but I kind of want to talk about the Reformation. So there were two parts of the Reformation. There's the Southern and the Northern. The Northern Protestant Reformation in Europe was brought about to try and correct the abuses within the Catholic Church, and it succeeded in quite a bit of them. Erasmus, Martin Luther, John Calvin, Martin Bucer. On the medieval ages, Francis Schaeffer, renowned, I wouldn't say theologian, but he's a very big Christian.
Yeah.
He passed away a few years ago, unfortunately. He said, nevertheless, the pristine Christianity set forth in the New Testament gradually became distorted. A humanistic element was added. Increasingly, the authority of the church took precedence over the teaching of the Bible. This is the problem in the Middle Ages. The church was given a higher priority and authority than God himself, which can spell a lot of trouble.
Yeah, there's a lot of problems with humans making themselves have a lot of power.
Yeah.
Even over God. So.
Then the rise of Protestantism and the Reformation, it was really a revolt against the Catholic Church, and it sought to bring ad fontes, or back to the sources, or back to the founts. Is that what you said?
To the fonts.
Back
to the fonts.
So like a fountain, it has the water coming out of it, and where does it come from? It comes from a source. So go back to the sources, essentially, instead of what was happening then.
Yeah.
So during the 16th century, when the Reformation was taking place, there really was no such thing as religious freedom as we experience today. So there was a massive Protestant. I know you haven't gotten to this yet, but there was a massive Protestant persecution going on in Christendom at the time, which was dangerous because it was silencing other people for having other religious opinions, which is not what we view today, even though it was viewed correct kind of at the time.
Right.
It's hard to sometimes look at the lenses of history and see good and bad. In reality, these people were doing what they believed was right.
Yeah.
Versus today, we know that's not correct at all.
Yeah, it seems like through history, there seems like a lot of back and forth going on. Like with the Greeks, they had some freedoms. They had religious freedom for the most part. Am I correct?
Yes, they did. Yeah.
But even with a lot of other things in the world, it seems like regress, then go back, regress. There's golden age, then the fall, and then a reconstruction. That's happened even in America too. So yeah,
it has.
So.
Let's see, where were we? Protestants wanted to see God, not the Pope, as the supreme authority in the church. This was kind of the whole main point of the Reformation. is that so people like Martin Luther still agreed with some of the practices of the Catholic Church, but he wanted to see God in Christ elevated to the top, justification by faith, not through works, as kind of the overarching theme, instead of having the Pope being able to grant you everlasting life, which we know is not true.
Yeah.
3,
Audio recording.
2, 1.
So essentially, the philosophy of that time was wrapped around in the supremacy of the papacy. The Catholic Church was supreme over everything. The Pope was the head, and Reformation was about bringing God and justification by faith back into the picture.
Yeah.
You have anything else you want to add to it?
Not really. I think we can go to the next one.
This next one's going to hit a little more home to most of us. It's going to be covering the 17th to 19th century.
America.
Yeah, so when we reach the 17th, 18th century, we see a pretty fundamental shift in terms of the approach to knowledge. We start with philosopher René Descartes. He began the shift from his philosophy of doubt that focused on validating God through the self.
I found that very interesting, actually.
It does spell some troubles later on, but it is a very interesting philosophy.
Yeah, it makes me think.
His philosophy was, if I'm doubting, then I'm doubting, then I can validate that I'm doubting, which means I exist.
That's a mind-boggler.
Yeah. So, like I was saying, his philosophy shifted the focus from God to proving God through the validation of himself. And then we get to philosophers like John Locke, who there's a dual-fold relationship to him. The first part of his philosophy focused around philosophy of government and private property, which the founding fathers used to help establish the governing powers of the U.S. government.
For sure.
But his philosophy of knowledge actually led to the downfall of absolute truth as we know it, because he affirmed reality, and then David Hume read Locke and established his philosophy of, I don't even call it unknowledge. Basically what he did is that he shredded every single grasp of knowledge, saying that we can't actually know anything. So, for instance, if I dropped this water bottle, what would happen if I dropped it?
It would hit the table probably.
Right, it would hit the
Smash
table.
computer.
But what happens if I dropped it again?
Different outcome, maybe. Depends.
Right. His philosophy was that you can't actually know it's going to hit the table. It could explode into a bunch of butterflies. So he was basically saying that you can't actually know anything because everything is unknowable, which is not.
Just like, life's not worth it if that's true. Honestly.
Right, and he was a weird guy. But then we get to Immanuel Kant. He tried to salvage knowledge by synthesizing rationalism and empiricism. So rationalism is reasoning through knowledge, and empiricism is knowledge through the senses. So he tried to create a synthesis. It was a synthetic a priori knowledge, I believe, is what he established, which is basically like knowledge beforehand. I can't exactly explain it because it's kind of confusing.
Yeah.
But he basically tried to recapture absolute truth in some form of grounding truth in absolutism.
Yeah, so would you say, like, there's kind of, like, almost another, like, tension, like, within the philosophy? Maybe not exactly like Plato and Aristotle, but, like, with Kant and who's the other person?
Hume?
Hume, yeah. There seems to be another tension that's kind of, like, threatening Western civilization.
It's interesting because a lot of philosophers are building off each other. So Plato built off of Socrates, and Aristotle built off of Plato, and Augustine built off of Aristotle, and then Aquinas built off of Aristotle and Augustine. So everyone's building off each other.
Progress is pretty nice.
Progress, but sometimes it's not progress.
Yeah, regression.
Right, regression sometimes.
Yeah.
Which makes sense in reality because we are humans. I mean, we're not always perfecting. We could be regressing. We could be perfecting sometimes.
Right.
So what we're seeing, we'll continue on here, but what we're seeing is a shift from, yes, we're attaining knowledge, to no, we're not. We're going back a step, which kind of happened with Hegel, which it's kind of a confusing subject as well with his synthesis triangles. But
yeah, do you think this is kind of an interesting thing I thought on the top of my head? Going back, do you think it kind of helped in a sense to like make sure we're on the right track in a sense? So like there's two sides and there's like discourse in a sense. It's not like we're just taking one idea and pushing forward.
Oh yeah,
we had other
definitely,
guys like
yeah.
on the opposite end saying, "Oh, what about this? What about that?" And I think going back in a sense isn't bad if like we make sure we're actually going
Pursuing
in
the
the
right
right direction.
thing.
Because like, for example, I have like whenever I played tennis, I had to change the grip, like how I swung the ball, and I had done a bad grip for the longest time, and it wasn't as good of a shot. But I had to learn a new grip, and my coach would say it's like 2 steps back, or 1 step back, 2 steps forward. So I got to step back, make sure I'm doing the right thing, and then I can move forward and get even better.
Yeah,
Because I know I'm doing the right
C.S. Lewis talked about that, about reading old books.
Yeah.
So we can't just read new books, we have to read old books as well. And I think that's important, like what you were saying, going back and examining what happened in the past to improve upon the future is really important. I think we're kind of seeing this with philosophy. We're seeing a regression in perfection over time.
Exactly. I think it's important.
And then we get to a really awful period in philosophy. Friedrich Nietzsche. My notes say the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche is quite convoluted. Essentially, Nietzsche argued that society had killed any concept of God because God was being used to merely uphold society, and that Christianity in Europe was largely dead at the time. So Nietzsche basically was saying that we have killed any concept that God can ever exist because all he's being used for is to uphold society.
Like he's pretty much the only thing that
is holding society together.
Is that a bad thing though?
Well, depending. If he's saying all of Europe was spiritually dead, basically.
Oh, so they're not actually being Christians. They're just using it as a power, like crutch.
Yeah.
And I guess that's what Catholicism did in a sense.
Yeah,
with, like,
I mean,
popes
that's true.
Gain all power. They're basically a king in a sense. So.
So, what then is the fate of Christianity?
Right.
I mean, keep in mind, Nietzsche published that book. That was in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which was published in 1900. That was 120 years ago. And he said God is dead in society.
Only 120 years ago?
Only 120 years ago.
Dang.
So now we're approaching, not modern, but we're approaching times that were not that far away from us.
Right. It's getting more recent.
So now we're moving on towards modern philosophy and the Christian impact. There's several different philosophies within modern philosophy, but mainly I'm going to be talking about existentialism and individualism. Existentialism was founded by Søren Kierkegaard unofficially. He's not really a real existentialist, but he kind of is. Kierkegaard basically said reality is absurd. The only way to find meaning is cast yourself into God. Which, I mean,
complete faith.
I like the effort, but it kind of discounts everything.
Right. It's like basically saying only the spiritual realm matters.
Yeah.
And like physical doesn't matter, which is
Right.
not God's intention.
Right. But then existentialists, what they did was that they said everything's absurd, so let's do whatever we want.
Right.
So existentialists basically tried to justify their radical living through saying reality is absurd.
Exactly. They can do whatever they want.
Right. Okay. Sorry. Another
malfunction.
Golly. Again,
Batteries.
we're new at this.
We have a dead battery. We have a time crunch. It's okay.
We're gonna try and nail this down, but we're almost done. What was I talking about? Individualism?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so individualism started with Descartes, kind of reaffirming the self, which was very shocking at the time for intellectuals because they thought we should be focusing only on God, not the self.
Mm-hmm.
There are some good and bad draws to individualism.
Yeah, with anything.
Right, with anything.
Yeah.
So individualism emphasizes independence and self-reliance, which isn't necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, that's good.
But it needs to have a correct center in order to be meaningful. So if it's centered around God, God gives us our individual identity, it gives us our independence, He gives us our self-reliance.
Right.
And that's a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
But not if it's focused on individualism in the sense where I can do anything I want to because I want to.
There's a point where individualism is purely selfish, and there's also an individualism that grants freedom so that you can help your community,
right,
help those around you, and pretty much the world.
Yeah. And we're kind of getting towards the end of history here, modern history.
Just like to the present, not the end of
right,
history.
not history itself.
Well, maybe.
But
2020.
right, we'll see. So we're going to be talking about evangelism now, which is a really big thing in the 70s, which it still kind of is, not as big, which is a sad thing. Evangelism in the 70s was thriving with leaders such as Billy Graham. People were converting to Christianity who were looking to fill their souls with something else besides sex and drugs, which could not provide the content and peace they were looking for.
Ultimate satisfaction.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's really prevalent now. I think we're almost, I think personally we're on another great awakening, if you would say.
You think so?
Yeah, yeah, I think so.
How so?
I think so. I don't know, because in the Bible you can see when Israel goes against God and they come back to God. And I think we're it's a pendulum throughout history.
I guess that's true.
And I think we're seeing that pendulum start to swing really far to one side, and it's going to come crashing down the other, and God is going to be, I feel like he's going to be prevalent in society once again. I hope so.
And that'd be good.
But the only way to do that is for the next point, the modern church, to act. The modern church is actually facing is in a multifaceted place right now. We know more about the Bible and Christian theology and history than ever, but I personally don't feel like the church is making the outreach it should be making at this present time. I feel like that it could be helping a lot more people than it is.
Yeah.
It's casting out people that it shouldn't be casting out, because God is calling us to love others even though we're all sinful.
Yeah.
As a Christian philosophy, we need to bring others in.
Yeah. I think the church, there's lots of different priorities that different churches have.
Right.
And I think different emphases on certain things, it can be a good thing. Like, baptism, missions, all of those things, worship, they're all good things. But if they're too emphasized and they neglect other things, it can be a problem, I think.
Yeah. So I think we did it.
Made it to the present time.
Time.
We are where we are. We are where we are today because of Western Civ and philosophy. And all these things have been very fascinating to me and stuff like that. So it's just very interesting.
Let me make this a concluding statement. I think that Western civilization has thrived because it continues to place value on the individual.
Text.
Place value on the individual and seeks to pursue knowledge, wisdom, and truth. Western civilization has grown from many different sources, but God has blessed Western civilization because he has chosen it to spread his message to the world. There's only one thing you can remember from this podcast. Let it be this. R.C. Sproul once said that not all ideas issue in intangible products. Some issues are harebrained, yet even the dreamer's fanciful ideas often become honed into sharp concepts with massive consequences. The way we think impacts the culture around us. We need to consider ideas and their consequences as they impact the world. Thanks everyone for tuning in.
First episode in the books.
First episode in the books, baby.
Yeah.
And we'll see you next time.
See ya.
There you go.
Whoa!
Oh my
Did
gosh.
It felt really good.
First episode.